name of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, I am bold to bring you this word today. Amen. As you might remember, I have taken a little detour in my preaching pattern into something called the narrative lectionary. And while we will spend the next little while in the Gospel of Matthew, we will be taking it in different pieces than is my usual practice. And this morning is no exception. And I offer that caveat because it's usually, and the preachers in the room will agree, it is a slam dunk when the Beatitudes come up in the lectionary. They're the easiest thing in Christendom to preach on, especially when you read them in Matthew's Gospel. Because Matthew's Gospel does not have that inverse list of woe to you who did thus and such and the other, as Luke's Gospel does. Luke's Gospel seems to want to divide folks into opposing teams. Are you on the blessed side or the woe to you side? It's always a bit of a challenge. But Matthew, no. Matthew is easy. In Matthew's Gospel this morning, there is nothing in the Beatitudes but hope for the downtrodden, a breath of fresh air for the weary and worried people of God. So it's usually a lark. The Beatitudes show up, and we can imagine whatever it is about our current situation that falls into one or the other of Jesus' categories. We call it all blessing, and then we head down to the fellowship hall for coffee and goodies. Easy. But not quite so today. Today it's different. Today the reading spans a little more space and covers a little more emotional depth. It turns out that the Sermon on the Mount takes a turn or two in its length and breadth, though we rarely find that out because we rarely read so far in one sitting. And yet here we are 20 verses in, only partway through the sermon, mind, and we have blessings, and we have salt, and we have light, and righteousness, and the fulfillment of the law, and a little bit of finger shaking besides. Because, as it happens, Jesus refuses to let us rest on our blessings. We should not be surprised. Now, the hope and the comfort are still there. I'm not taking any of that away from you. The weary and those who mourn, the meek and the persecuted, the merciful and those who long for things to be done correctly are still singled out for blessing. The joy that they are promised has been taken away from them by the misery that comes from living in a competitive, chaotic, and challenging world. And that's a very important thing to remember. The blessings are there. Jesus offers them because they have been taken. The people whom Jesus addresses, to whom he addresses these blessings, are not simply unlucky. They have been robbed. There are people who twist the world to their advantage, and that means some. It means many are left out. Such is the world that Jesus comes to, a world that is shattered along partisan lines. The imperial Roman mindset has endured for ages. There is within the body of Israel a desire to throw off these Roman chains. And some in the provincial hinterland of Palestine long for freedom and independence. Some even hanker for a taste of the good old days. And within even that group, there are divisions. Within the people of Israel, there is no single mindset. There are royalists who long for one nation under one king, under one God, and that's the order of things for them. They want a throwback kingdom. And there are others who crave a religious reawakening. And in Jesus' day, the religious authorities have gained the upper hand in this fight. They have some measure of power. They have cozied up to the Romans. They may even get their way in the end. But it will be a very regimented, very legalistic way of life should they prevail. And along comes Jesus, who is navigating these waters from in the midst of them. Yet he brings with him a fresh approach to the divine, a new way of thinking and talking about God and God's family and even God's kingdom. Jesus offers a more direct approach. Love and kindness and mercy, a reordering of priorities that will put things right. And first in his most important sermon comes this promise of blessedness. The promise that the world that you are currently experiencing is not the world as God intended it to be. And that true righteousness, a right and orderly and merciful and just way of doing things, is still preferable and still possible. These blessings, this happiness is aimed at those who are troubled by the way things are. And those people who are most troubled are not among the powerful or the wealthy or those longing for a return to the thrilling days of yesteryear. They are ordinary people troubled by the way things are. And to them, Jesus offers the hope that there is a different way to order the world, a different way to experience the connection between humanity and God. Now, Jesus, throughout his life, will say a lot more about that. But in this particular message, he then sets us a challenge with those things in mind. The challenge is that the comfort, the promise of a blessing has to mean something. And so at the end of the Beatitudes, where we have usually stopped and taken a deep breath and patted ourselves on the back and said, yes, that's us in a nutshell, Jesus isn't done. You are the salt of the earth, he says. You are light and life, a city on the hill. What he says before we can even catch our breath is stand tall in these blessings. Go public with these blessings. Carry them to your communities, to your neighborhood, to your families, to the world. As Jesus tells it, there is a cycle that is at work here. The meek, those who mourn, the poor in spirit, the tender-hearted, they will take the lead. They have been thrown aside, and they will come back into the cycle and make it work. They must show the way. We must show the way. The principles of God's peaceable kingdom have been pushed aside long enough. But this is not a call to arms. This is not an urgent demand to overthrow the oppressor and make them pay. And so Jesus alienates the zealots and those who would fight for their right to be free. No, this is an invitation for goodness and mercy to become the standard measure of how a society works. The kingdom of heaven that Jesus talks about is not the reward at the end of the journey, though there is reward at the end of the journey. No, the kingdom of heaven that Jesus talks of is the goal for the here and now. A kinder, gentler way of organizing humanity. Get ready for that, Jesus says. Go and model your blessedness to the world and see what happens. But be careful, because being thrust into a leadership role is challenging. Beware of the feeling of power that can accompany your role at the front of the parade. The final section of this part of the sermon is a warning. There are still rules, Jesus says. History is important too. Learn its lessons and don't repeat its mistakes. This seemingly discordant warning about keeping the letter of the law is meant to remind us not to become the thing we despise. The scribes and the Pharisees had been in a position of prominence for a long time, but they had become tyrants of the holy, judging without justice, managing without mercy. The idea that perfection was both possible and desirable had created a religion of impossible demands, not a path to blessedness, but a fence around it. So Jesus declares that he has come to fulfill the law and the prophets, and that declaration is both a challenge and a warning. Because our instinct when we hear those words is to imagine a perfectionist, literalist, checking of the boxes way of doing things. But the truth is that nothing that Jesus says or does indicates that that is how we should behave. Jesus has his own way of thinking and talking and acting where the law is concerned, unless you needed reminding. And those actions suggest that rather than the letter of the law, Jesus actually embodies the true spirit of the law. Now, I struggled with this because there it is written for us in the gospel according to St. Matthew. Jesus has said this. I don't believe that he's been misquoted, and I don't think I'm taking liberties. I'm suggesting that the thrust of Jesus' work, the sum of his life, death, and resurrection, all suggest that he's asking us to look past the surface of this statement. He is suggesting this tongue-in-cheek, perhaps. The letter of the law must also abide the spirit of it. That is something Jesus does. And the context of this extended set of sayings that we call the Sermon on the Mount, the context is everything here. Because Jesus goes on to say, not much after this reading stops, he goes on to say that not only is murder a sin according to the law, but anger and thoughts of murder are sinful. As sinful as actually taking a life. And I believe that his point here is that there is no safety in legalism. There is nowhere to stop once you go down that road. Neither is there safe refuge in some gloriously remembered past where everything was as it should be, because nothing has ever been as it should be. No, Jesus suggests to me in my reading of these things that the keys to the kingdom are there in the moment, in the here and now, waiting for us to seize them and use them. And God waits on our understanding that the way we treat one another can either bless us or break us. So the choice is ours. And I think Jesus suggests that the choice is clear. The spirit of the law is found in the prophets. Seek justice, mercy, and compassion. Love one another, Jesus will famously say later. Serve in humility as Jesus does. Seek grace in all things. The path to that kingdom is stretched out before us. And Jesus is leading the way. What does God want from you? It's still for you to decide.